Have you ever stood in a place so ancient you could feel the whispers of history in the wind? A place where the dust beneath your feet has witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth of faiths, and the echoes of battles that still define our world? This is the story of such a place, and of a people whose very existence seems to defy the laws of probability. We live in an age of certainty, an age of data, of satellite imagery, of strategic analysis that can predict the trajectory of a missile from 1,000 miles away. We trust what we can measure, what we can prove. We build our understanding of the world on a foundation of logic and reason. But what happens when that foundation cracks? What happens when events unfold that mock our calculations, when history takes a turn so improbable it feels scripted by an unseen hand? This is not a story about politics. It is not about borders or headlines. It is a journey into the quiet, unsettling space between coincidence and intervention. It's an investigation into a pattern of events stretching across 3,000 years that has left generals, historians, and even skeptics grasping for explanations. It is the story of Israel. We are told that God once fought for this nation with a single angel, that 185,000 Assyrian soldiers, the most feared army on earth, simply ceased to be in one night. No battle, no siege, just an inexplicable silent death that fell upon them as they slept outside the walls of Jerusalem. We are told of a king who, facing 3 invading armies, sent not his soldiers but his choir to the front lines. And as they began to sing, the enemy armies turned on one another in a frenzy of confusion and self-destruction. These are tales from an ancient text, easily dismissed as myth or metaphor. But what if the story didn't end there? What if that same impossible pattern continues to repeat, not with angels and heavenly choirs, but with malfunctioning radars, sudden gusts of wind, and missile failures so statistically unlikely they defy belief? Tonight, we peel back the layers of modern warfare and look into the heart of these mysteries. We will welcome the facts. We will welcome the rational explanations. But we will also listen for that ancient whisper in the sand. Because in the story of Israel, there are moments where the line between heaven and earth seems to grow impossibly thin. Our journey begins, as it must, in that distant past, on a night of impossible odds when the world's greatest empire brought its wrath to the gates of Jerusalem and came face to face, not with an army, but an unnerving, perfect silence.
The year is 701 BC. The Assyrian Empire is a relentless war machine, a storm of iron and fear sweeping across the known world. Under the command of King Sennacherib, they have crushed kingdoms, leveled cities, and left a trail of terror in their wake. And now that storm has come to a halt before the walls of Jerusalem, the defiant heart of the tiny kingdom of Judah. Inside the city, King Hezekiah and his people face annihilation. They are an island of desperation in an ocean of enemies. 185,000 of Assyria's finest warriors have made their camp, a sprawling city of tents whose campfires glitter in the dark like a swarm of malevolent stars. The siege is absolute. The end feels not just likely, but inevitable. Sennacherib, drunk on his own power, sends a message to Hezekiah. It is more than a threat, it is a theological challenge. Do not let your God in whom you trust deceive you, he scoffs. Have the gods of any other nations delivered them from my hand? He lists the cities he has conquered, the peoples he has extinguished. To him, the God of Israel is just another local deity about to be proven powerless. For any rational military leader, the options were stark: surrender in humiliation or fight and die a pointless, bloody death. Hezekiah chose a third path, a path of radical, almost insane faith. He did not sharpen swords or prepare boiling oil. He walked into the temple, spread Sennacherib's mocking letter before the altar, and he prayed. His prayer was not for strength in battle. It was an act of complete surrender, not to the enemy, but to the ancient promise that his people were not alone. He placed the fate of his nation entirely into the hands of the unseen. That night, an anxious silence fell over Jerusalem. The watchmen on the walls could hear the sounds of the Assyrian camp, the distant laughter of soldiers, the restless stomping of horses, the clank of armor. They waited. They waited for the dawn and for the final, brutal assault that would surely erase them from history. But when the morning came, it brought with it a different kind of silence, an unnatural, chilling stillness that blanketed the entire valley. As the gates of Jerusalem creaked open, the scouts did not see an army preparing for attack. They saw a graveyard. From one end of the camp to the other, 185,000 men lay dead. There were no wounds, no signs of struggle. It was as if, in the depths of their sleep, life itself had been quietly recalled. The Bible records it simply. The angel of the Lord went out and put to death 185,000 in the Assyrian camp. Modern historians have searched for logical causes, a sudden plague, a fast-spreading contamination of the water supply, perhaps, but the sheer scale and speed, the complete annihilation of a hardened veteran army in a single night, stretches the bounds of conventional explanation. It remains a profound historical enigma. This event became a cornerstone of the Jewish psyche. It was not a military victory, it was a divine rescue, a lesson burned into their collective memory. When facing impossible odds, when human strategy fails, another force can enter the equation. A force that does not play by the rules of men. And that chilling silence from that long-ago field would echo for centuries, its lesson tested time and time again.
Generations later, the kingdom of Judah found itself in a familiar, terrifying position. King Jehoshaphat, a descendant of Hezekiah, stared out from the walls of Jerusalem not at one army, but at a massive coalition of three. The Moabites, the Ammonites, and the Meunites had joined forces, a vast horde marching to wipe Judah off the map. The scripture says the king was terrified. His people were in a panic. The odds were once again impossible. This time, there was no siege. The enemy was on the move, a tide of steel and fury just a day's march away. There was no time for elaborate defenses. Jehoshaphat, remembering the stories of his ancestors, turned to the only strategy that had ever worked against such overwhelming force. He declared a fast across the land and led his people in prayer. But this prayer had a different texture. It was not a quiet plea in the temple. It was a public declaration of dependence. Standing before the entire nation, Jehoshaphat cried out, "We have no power to face this vast army that is attacking us. We do not know what to do, but our eyes are on you." The response, according to the Chronicle, came not from a king or a general, but from a prophet in the crowd. He spoke with a voice of absolute certainty. "Do not be afraid or discouraged because of this vast army, for the battle is not yours, but God's. You will not have to fight this battle. Take up your positions, stand firm, and see the deliverance the Lord will give you." What happened next is one of the most bizarre tactical decisions in the history of warfare. The next morning, as the Israelite army marched out to face the enemy, King Jehoshaphat did not place his elite soldiers at the front. He did not send his chariots or his archers. Instead, he appointed men to walk ahead of the army, dressed not in armor, but in holy vestments. Their only weapon was their voice. As they marched toward an enemy that outnumbered them beyond counting, they began to sing. "Give thanks to the Lord, for his love endures forever," they sang. Imagine the scene, a small, outmatched army led by a choir, walking calmly towards their own destruction. It must have looked like madness. But as their voices echoed through the valleys, something extraordinary happened within the enemy camp. The scriptures describe it as a divine ambush. A sudden, inexplicable wave of paranoia and confusion swept through the coalition forces. The Ammonites and Moabites suddenly turned on their allies from Mount Seir and slaughtered them. And then, once they had finished, they turned on each other. By the time Jehoshaphat's army arrived at the lookout point overlooking the battlefield, they saw no enemy line poised to attack. They saw a valley filled with the dead. The three armies had completely annihilated one another. It took the men of Judah 3 days to collect the plunder. Again, one can search for rationalizations. Perhaps a long simmering rivalry between the allied armies finally boiled over at a crucial moment. Perhaps a misunderstanding led to friendly fire on a catastrophic scale. But the timing, at the exact moment the choir began to sing, is what elevates the story from a historical curiosity to a foundational narrative of faith. It cemented the idea that the most powerful weapon in Israel's arsenal was not of this world. It was an appeal to a higher authority, an act of trust so profound it could turn the tide of an impossible war. These stories of silent death and conquering songs would become the bedrock for a nation reborn in the 20th century,
a nation that would soon find itself in need of miracles once more. Let us fast forward 2.5 millennia. The world has changed beyond recognition. Empires are built not just with swords, but with tanks, airplanes, and ideologies. And in the smoldering ashes of the Second World War, a new chapter of this ancient story was about to be written. May 14th, 1948, the British mandate over Palestine expires. In Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion stands before a small crowd and declares the establishment of the State of Israel. It was a moment of breathtaking hope, born from unimaginable sorrow. The Jewish people, after 2,000 years of exile and persecution, culminating in the horror of the Holocaust, finally had a home. But that home was born onto a battlefield. Within hours of the declaration, 5 regular Arab armies, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, invaded from all sides. They were established, well-equipped forces, many of them trained and armed by the British. Their stated goal was unequivocal: to drive the Jews into the sea. The fledgling Israeli state had no real army. It had the Haganah, a paramilitary organization composed of farmers, scholars, and a corps of veterans from the British Army. But most of its fighters were Holocaust survivors, men and women with ghosts in their eyes and numbers tattooed on their arms, who had been in the country for only a few years, sometimes just a few weeks. They were poorly armed, with a mismatched collection of rifles, homemade submachine guns, and almost no artillery, no tanks, or no air force to speak of. On paper, it was not a war. It was a slaughter waiting to happen. The Arab forces were vastly superior in numbers, training, and equipment. The world watched on, expecting the Jewish state to be a brief, tragic footnote in modern history. The ensuing conflict, Israel's War of Independence, was a brutal, desperate affair. Every town, every kibbutz became a fortress. Jerusalem was cut off, its people starving. The fighting was house to house, hand to hand. It was a struggle for sheer existence. And yet, against all logic, Israel survived. Historians point to several factors: the Arabs' poor coordination, internal rivalries, and the Israelis' fierce determination, fighting with the knowledge that there was nowhere else to run. These are valid points, but they don't fully capture the stories that emerged from the smoke and fire of that war. Stories told not by generals in briefing rooms, but by exhausted soldiers in the trenches. Stories that sounded strangely familiar. Stories that echoed those ancient tales of impossible deliverance. Tales of battles that turned on a dime for no discernible reason. Of enemies who suddenly retreated when victory was in their grasp. And in one extraordinary case, of an army that was not of this world.
The road to Jerusalem was a lifeline. In 1948, it was a choke point, controlled by the heavily fortified police station at Latrun, manned by the elite soldiers of Jordan's Arab Legion. For the Israelis, taking Latrun was not just a strategic objective. It was a matter of survival for the 100,000 Jews besieged in Jerusalem. They tried again and again. Operation Bin Nun Aleph, Operation Bin Nun Bet. Each assault was a bloody failure. The newly formed 7th Brigade, composed largely of untrained Holocaust survivors, was thrown against the fortress and cut to pieces. The morale of the young nation was beginning to break. It was during one of these desperate nights of fighting that something strange happened. The story is not found in official military histories, but it persists in the diaries and memories of the men who were there, on both sides. An Israeli soldier, a young man who had survived the death camps, was huddled in a trench, waiting for the order to attack. He looked up toward the Jordanian positions and saw them, figures, tall, cloaked in white, moving silently along the enemy ramparts. They seemed to glow with a faint internal light. He was not alone. Other soldiers saw them too. Panic and confusion rippled through the ranks. Were they ghosts? Were they an elite enemy unit they hadn't been warned about? But the real story came later from the other side. After the war, accounts began to surface from Jordanian soldiers who had been defending Latrun that night. They too had seen the figures, but they had not seen them as ghosts. They described an army of angels clad in white, with flaming swords, protecting the walls of Jerusalem. They told of a paralyzing supernatural fear that gripped their hearts, convincing them that the God of Israel was fighting alongside his people. Some accounts claim that this divine vision was the reason entire units refused to advance. What are we to make of this? Mass hallucination brought on by the trauma and exhaustion of battle? a shared myth born from the religious fervor of both sides. Perhaps. It is the easiest explanation, but the details are specific, consistent across accounts from men who had no reason to collaborate. They speak not of a vague feeling but of a visual phenomenon witnessed by many. This story and others like it began to form a new layer of the Israeli mythos. It suggested that the ancient covenant was not just a memory. It felt active, present. It was one thing to read about an angel slaying an army in a holy book written thousands of years ago. It was another thing entirely to hear a soldier, his hands still trembling from the fight, whisper that he had seen one with his own eyes. This wasn't about strategy. This was about something else breaking through into the brutal reality of war. It was a moment when the veil thinned, leaving behind not proof, but a profound and unsettling question. A question that would be asked again, on a much grander scale, 19 years later, when Israel would face the greatest threat to its existence since its birth. Of course, I will continue the script from chapter 6 through chapter 15, adhering to the established visionary realism style. The narrative will weave together historical accounts with a deeper, more human exploration of the events, always circling the central, profound question. 19 years after its birth and fire, the state of Israel was once again trapped. By the spring of 1967, the rhetoric of annihilation had reached a fever pitch. Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, speaking to a roaring sea of supporters, declared, "Our basic objective will be the destruction of Israel. The Arab people want to fight." It was not empty talk. He blockaded the Straits of Tiran, cutting off Israel's southern lifeline. He expelled UN peacekeepers from the Sinai and moved nearly 100,000 troops and 1,000 tanks to the border. To the north, Syria relentlessly shelled Israeli farms from the strategic high ground of the Golan Heights. To the east, Jordan signed a mutual defense pact with Egypt, placing its army under Egyptian command. For the tiny nation of Israel, it was a waking nightmare. There were slivers of land surrounded, outmanned, and outgunned. The world watched and offered little more than platitudes and calls for restraint. The memory of the Holocaust was not a distant historical event. It was a living wound in the heart of every family. The words "never again" were not a slogan. They were the very reason for their existence. Now, it seemed again was imminent. Inside Israel, the atmosphere was thick with dread. It was a period of national anxiety so intense it became known as the waiting. Parks were dug up to serve as mass graves for the tens of thousands of casualties they expected. The nation held its breath, suspended between a terrifying past and an unthinkable future. The Israeli cabinet was paralyzed by debate. To strike first would be to invite the condemnation of the world. To wait would be to commit national suicide. Every logical calculation, every military assessment pointed to a catastrophic defeat. Their enemies were confident, their allies were silent, and their time was running out. In this crucible of fear and desperation, a plan was born. A plan so audacious, so risky, it bordered on suicidal. It was a single roll of the dice, with the nation's entire existence staked on the outcome. It was not a plan based on superior firepower, but on impossible precision, and something that could only be described as a leap of faith. They called it Operation Focus. The goal, to destroy the entire Egyptian Air Force on the ground in a single, preemptive strike. To fail would mean leaving Israel's skies defenseless against hundreds of enemy bombers. It would be the end. As the pilots prepared for their mission in the early morning hours of June 5th, they were not just flying into battle. They were flying into the pages of history, about to become actors in a drama that would, once again, defy all rational explanation.
At 7:45 a.m. on June 5, 1967, nearly 200 Israeli jets took off. They flew in complete radio silence, skimming just feet above the waves of the Mediterranean, then banking low over the Sinai Desert, under the enemy's radar horizon. It was a flight path of breathtaking audacity. Their target was Egypt, the most powerful of the Arab air forces. The plan relied on a series of factors so precise they were almost clairvoyant. The Israeli intelligence service, Mossad, had determined that the Egyptian Air Force conducted no dawn patrols. Their pilots, after a single morning flight, would be back at their bases eating breakfast. The senior commanders of the Egyptian military would be airborne, flying to a meeting in the Sinai, their communication channels jammed with their own transport planes' signals. And, in the most crucial detail of all, the Egyptians had a habit. Every morning, they would shut down their entire air defense radar network for a period of maintenance, fearing that Israeli electronic warfare might exploit it. Israeli intelligence knew the window. It was small, but it was everything. Was this simply brilliant intelligence work? Absolutely. But what followed was more than just a successful military operation. It was a display of perfection so absolute, it felt otherworldly. As the Israeli jets screamed over their targets, the Egyptian Air Force was completely unaware. The planes were parked in neat rows on the tarmac, exposed and vulnerable. The first wave of the attack was devastating. Using specially designed runway-busting bombs, the Israelis cratered the airfields, trapping the Egyptian MiGs before they could even attempt to take off. Then, they circled back, time and again, methodically destroying the grounded aircraft with cannon fire. Within 3 hours, the story was over. Over 300 Egyptian aircraft, the pride of Nasser's military, were reduced to burning heaps of metal. The Israeli Air Force had lost just 19 planes, many to anti-aircraft fire from bases that finally awoke from their stupor. The backbone of the Arab coalition's air power had been shattered before the war had officially even begun. Think about the chain of events. The Egyptian commanders are all in one plane, incommunicado, the pilots are at breakfast, and the nation's entire radar defense system is turned off at the precise moment of the attack. Any single one of these elements could be called a coincidence, a stroke of luck, but all of them happening at the same time on the same morning? It creates a pattern that feels less like chance and more like design. The Israeli pilots were not supermen. They were young men bound together in what author Ann Patchett would call a found family, trusting each other with their lives. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their very future. But as they flew back to their bases that morning, through skies that were now miraculously theirs, even they must have felt it. They had executed the plan, but the perfection of its circumstances felt like it had been arranged by a force far greater than their own. The door had been opened for them, and through that door, they were about to rewrite the map of the Middle East. 6 years later, on October 6, 1973, it was Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, a day of fasting, of prayer, of quiet introspection. The nation comes to a standstill. There are no radio broadcasts, no television, no cars on the streets. It is a day when Israel is at its most vulnerable, its guards spiritually and militarily down. And that is the day the enemy chose to attack. In a brilliantly coordinated surprise assault, Egypt and Syria struck. In the south, Egyptian forces stormed across the Suez Canal, overwhelming the thinly defended Bar-Lev line. But it was in the north that the existential threat was most severe. On the Golan Heights, a vast Syrian army, equipped with the latest Soviet weaponry, poured across the ceasefire line. Fewer than 200 Israeli tanks and a few hundred soldiers stood against a tidal wave of over 1,400 Syrian tanks and 1,000 artillery pieces. The surprise was total. The intelligence failure was catastrophic. The soldiers on the front lines, many of them fasting for the holy day, were caught completely unprepared. The initial hours of the Yom Kippur War were a desperate, chaotic fight for survival. Syrian tanks rolled through Israeli positions. The radio channels were filled with frantic calls for help, with the sounds of battle, with the last words of young men. It seemed the 1967 victory had made Israel arrogant, and now they were paying the ultimate price. Prime Minister Golda Meir, in a voice heavy with the weight of her nation's history, would later speak of the terror of those first few days. The very real fear that this could be the end of the Third Temple, the modern state of Israel. Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, the architect of the 67 victory, fell into a deep despair, speaking of the destruction of Israel in apocalyptic terms. This was not a battle of strategy. There was no time for a grand plan. This was a primal struggle of the few against the many. It was a test, not of technology or tactics, but of raw courage and the will to endure. On the windswept volcanic plateau of the Golan Heights, a handful of Israeli tank crews were about to face impossible odds. They were the only thing standing between the Syrian army and the heartland of Israel. Their stand would go down in history,
not just as a legendary battle, but as another moment where the inexplicable would tip the scales. They were about to enter a place that would forever be known as the Valley of Tears.
In the southern Golan, a single Israeli armored brigade, the 7th, found itself facing the bulk of the Syrian invasion. It was a scene from a nightmare. One Israeli commander, Avidor Kalanani, looked through his periscope and saw a sea of Syrian T-62 tanks advancing toward him. For every one of his tanks, there were at least 10 of the enemies. For 4 days and nights, a brutal, relentless battle raged. The Israeli crews fought with a desperate ferocity, firing, repositioning, firing again, knowing that every tank they lost brought the enemy closer to their homes and families. They fought until their ammunition ran low, until their tanks were damaged, until they were exhausted beyond human limits. Kahalani's radio crackled with the voices of his men, their fear mixed with a grim, almost surreal humor, a hallmark of people in impossible situations. They were fighting and dying, but they held the line. And then, on the 4th day, the Syrians mounted their final massive assault. Hundreds of tanks, a seemingly endless river of steel, began to advance, determined to finally break the Israeli defense. Kahalani had only a handful of operational tanks left. This was the end. He knew it. On the radio, he heard the commander of another unit, his voice breaking, say, "I can't hold on anymore." It was at this moment of absolute despair that the story takes another strange turn. Later accounts from Syrian tank commanders who were captured described a bizarre and frightening phenomenon. As they advanced, they did not see a handful of battered Israeli tanks. Through their sights, they saw a much larger force. They reported seeing hundreds of tanks appearing as if from nowhere, maneuvering with supernatural speed and accuracy. They believed they had stumbled into a trap, that the Israelis had a massive reserve force they knew nothing about. They called them ghost tanks. The fear and confusion created by this phantom army was palpable. The Syrian advance slowed, then faltered. Meanwhile, Kalanani, his own tank hit, his crew wounded, made one last desperate plea over the radio. He called for anyone who could still fight, anyone with a working tank, to join him for a final stand. A small group of 13 tanks, repaired on the fly, responded to his call and charged forward, directly into the heart of the Syrian formation. It was a suicidal gesture, but it was enough. The Syrian commanders, already spooked by the ghosts they were seeing and now facing a seemingly insane counterattack, made a decision that military analysts still debate to this day. At the very moment of their breakthrough, with the path to northern Israel wide open, they stopped, and then they began to retreat. No one knows exactly why. The official explanation was that they had outrun their supply lines. But for the exhausted Israeli soldiers who watched in disbelief as the massive army turned and fled, it felt like a miracle. They had not won through strength of arms. They had won because, at the critical moment, the enemy lost its nerve, frightened by an army that wasn't there. The Valley of Tears was littered with the burning wrecks of over 250 Syrian tanks. The 7th Brigade had held. Israel had been saved. But the question remained, hanging in the smoke-filled air. What did the Syrians see that day? The nature of war had changed again. In January of 1991, the threat to Israel came not from an army on its border, but from the sky. As the US-led coalition began its campaign to liberate Kuwait, Saddam Hussein of Iraq retaliated not against the coalition, but against Israel. He sought to provoke an Israeli response, hoping to shatter the fragile alliance between the United States and its Arab partners. His weapon was the Scud missile. For Israelis, this was a new kind of terror. The Scud was not a precision weapon, it was a blunt instrument of fear, a multi-ton ballistic missile that could be launched from hundreds of miles away, carrying a massive warhead. You never knew where it would land. It could hit an empty field, or it could land in the middle of a crowded apartment complex. For 42 days and nights, Israel was under siege from the sky. Air raid sirens became the soundtrack of daily life. The entire nation was forced into a state of agonizing helplessness. The United States, fearing the collapse of its coalition, pleaded with Israel not to retaliate. For the first time in its history, the Israeli Defense Forces were ordered to stand down, to absorb the blows without hitting back. Imagine the psychological toll. Families huddled in sealed rooms, wearing cumbersome gas masks, listening to the radio for the news of the latest impact. The fear was not just of the conventional explosives, but of the chemical warheads that Saddam was rumored to possess. Every siren was a moment of pure terror, a countdown to an unknown fate. This was not a war of territory, but a war on the nerves of a nation. It was a test of restraint, of discipline.
As the Scuds rained down, the people of Israel put their trust not in their own powerful army, but in their allies' promises and in newly deployed American Patriot missile batteries. But mostly, they waited and they prayed. They were once again the people of the siege, looking to the heavens not for a sign, but for a shield. Over the course of the war, 39 Scud missiles would be fired at Israel's most densely populated areas. The potential for mass casualties was enormous. What happened instead would become another chapter in the nation's book of improbable survival.
39 Scud missiles, each carrying over 1,000 pounds of high explosives, fired into the heart of Israel's largest cities, Tel Aviv and Haifa. By any military calculation, the death toll should have been in the hundreds, perhaps even thousands. The final tally? 1. One person was killed directly by a Scud impact. The statistics are so skewed, they seem to belong to a different reality. Missile after missile fell, but a pattern of near misses began to emerge that was simply uncanny. One Scud landed in the middle of a major intersection in Tel Aviv, but it was the middle of the night, during a curfew, and the street was empty. Another slammed into an apartment building in the Ramat Gan neighborhood, destroying several floors. Miraculously, the residents had all crowded into a reinforced bomb shelter in the basement just moments before. Another missile fell into the sea just yards from a packed beach. Again and again, the story was the same: massive destruction of property, but an astonishingly low number of casualties. While the Patriot missile system did intercept some of the Scuds, its success rate was far from perfect. Many got through. But even those that did seemed to be guided by an invisible hand away from human life. This phenomenon was not lost on the people living through it. In a nation of both secular and religious Jews, a new phrase entered the lexicon: the miracle of the Scuds. It was spoken with a sense of awe and disbelief. Secular news anchors, reporting on the latest impact, would find themselves using the word miracle to describe the lack of fatalities. It was in these small, personal stories that the larger narrative took root. The family that decided, for no particular reason, to sleep in the shelter that night. The man who was delayed leaving for work and missed being at the exact spot where a missile hit. These were not grand battlefield-scale events. They were intimate, quiet moments of grace. Was it just luck? A statistical anomaly on a national scale? Of course, that is the logical explanation, but for a people whose history is steeped in tales of divine protection, it felt like something more. It felt like a modern-day echo of an ancient promise. God didn't stop the missiles from being fired. He just seemed to nudge them, to ensure that the rain of fire fell on empty streets and empty rooms. It was a quiet, subtle form of intervention, one that left no physical proof, only a profound sense of wonder and a question that lingered long after the sirens fell silent. Who was guiding these missiles? Not all miracles arrive with the thunder of a collapsing army or the fire of an exploding missile. Sometimes they are quieter, a whisper, a sudden feeling, a decision made for reasons no one can quite explain. In the summer of 2006, Israel was at war again, this time with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Thousands of Katyusha rockets were fired into northern Israel. It was a terrifying time for the residents of cities like Haifa and Nairia, who spent weeks in bomb shelters. But after the war, Israeli bomb disposal units began to notice something strange. An unusually high number of the rockets that had landed, as many as 1 in 5, had failed to detonate. These were not old, poorly made weapons. They were standard-issue, factory-produced rockets. The failure rate was statistically abnormal, far higher than in any other conflict where these weapons had been used. Experts were puzzled. They spoke of manufacturing defects, of poor storage conditions. But for the families whose homes were hit by these dud rockets, it felt like a reprieve from a death sentence. Then came November 2012, during another conflict with Hamas in Gaza. This story is smaller, more personal, but no less profound. In the southern Israel town of Kiryat Malaki, a group of about 30 people, mostly elderly men and women, gathered every morning in a small apartment on the top floor of a 4-story building for a Torah class. On this particular morning, the teacher, a local rabbi, woke with a strange sense of unease. He couldn't shake it. For no logical reason, he felt compelled to cancel the class. He sent out a simple text message: "Class is canceled today. We will resume next week." 30 minutes after the class was supposed to have started, a grad rocket fired from Gaza slammed directly into that top-floor apartment. The explosion tore through the room where 30 people should have been sitting. It destroyed the tables, the chairs, the holy books. But because of one man's inexplicable feeling, the room was empty.
Not a single person was harmed. When asked later why he canceled the class, the rabbi had no concrete answer. It wasn't based on an intelligence warning or a specific threat. It was, he said, just a feeling, a deep, persistent nudge from within. These are the moments that don't make headlines. They are the quiet miracles, the invisible interventions that shape individual lives. A defective fuse, an uneasy feeling, a last-minute change of plans. For those who believe, these are not coincidences. They are the hand of God working not through grand displays of power, but through the subtle, intimate details of everyday life, whispering warnings to those who are willing to listen.
By the summer of 2014, the battlefield had evolved once more. The new guardian of Israel's skies was the Iron Dome, a technological marvel, a shield of algorithms and interceptors designed to shoot down short-range rockets in midair. During the 50-day conflict, known as Operation Protective Edge, the system would be put to its ultimate test. Hamas fired over 4,500 rockets from Gaza into Israel. Day and night the sirens wailed, and day and night the Iron Dome batteries launched their interceptors, creating starbursts of light in the sky as they met their targets. The system was astonishingly effective, with a success rate of over 90%. But no system is perfect. One day, during a particularly heavy barrage, a rocket was launched toward the heart of Tel Aviv. The city's air raid sirens screamed. In the Iron Dome Command Center, the operators tracked its trajectory. This one was different. It was on a direct path to hit one of the city's most iconic and densely populated locations, the Azrieli Towers, a massive complex of skyscrapers housing offices, a shopping mall, and a train station. Tens of thousands of people were in the target zone. The system locked on. The command was given: fire. 2 Tamir interceptors launched, streaking toward the incoming rocket, and then the unthinkable happened. Both missed. It was a 1 in a million failure. For the soldiers in the command center, time slowed to a crawl. They were helpless. There was nothing more they could do. They could only watch the red dot on their screen continue its deadly arc toward the heart of their largest city. They braced for the inevitable impact, for the news of catastrophic loss of life. The missile was seconds from impact. And then, something happened that is still spoken of with awe by those who witnessed it. Just as the rocket began its final descent, a powerful, inexplicable gust of wind seemed to materialize out of the clear blue sky. It came from the sea, hitting the rocket with such force that it was pushed off course. Instead of slamming into the towers, it was blown into the Mediterranean, exploding harmlessly in the water. The soldiers in the command center erupted in cheers and shouts of disbelief. The official report would later attribute the event to atmospheric conditions and a sudden change in wind patterns. But for the commander of the battery, a man of faith, the explanation was much simpler. It was the hand of God. He described the wind as something he had never seen before, a force so localized and so perfectly timed it defied meteorological explanation. The story spread like wildfire, a wind from the sea. It became another symbol of the nation's uncanny ability to escape disaster. Was it a freak weather event? Or was it the modern equivalent of the parting of the Red Sea, a natural force harnessed at a supernatural moment to protect a people who had placed their trust in the unseen? For decades, the threats had come from proxies, from terrorist groups armed and funded by a distant power. But on the night of April 13, 2024, the shadow war burst into the open. For the first time in its history, the Islamic Republic of Iran launched a direct, massive, and unprecedented attack on the State of Israel. It was a spectacle of terrifying power, designed to overwhelm and paralyze. Over 300 munitions were launched in coordinated waves. First came the Shahad drones, slow-moving but numerous, designed to saturate Israel's air defenses. Then came the cruise missiles, flying low and fast, and finally the ballistic missiles, arcing high into the stratosphere before plunging down toward their targets at hypersonic speeds. The world held its breath. Never before had a nation faced such a complex and multi-layered aerial assault. This was not a handful of Scuds or a barrage of Katyushas. This was the full might of a regional superpower, a storm of fire and steel aimed at military bases, airfields, and population centers across the country. The potential for devastation was immense. But Israel was ready. This was the moment its decades of innovation, its relentless focus on defense technology had been preparing for. A multi-layered shield of defense systems, working in perfect synchrony, roared to life. Far from Israel's borders, fighter jets from Israel, the US, the UK, and Jordan engaged the drones and cruise missiles. Closer to home, David's sling and the Arrow missile systems tracked the ballistic missiles as they re-entered the atmosphere. And over the cities, the familiar starbursts of the Iron Dome lit up the night sky. The result was nothing short of breathtaking. Of the more than 300 drones and missiles launched, 99% were intercepted. The few ballistic missiles that did get through caused only minor damage to an airbase. There were no fatalities. A little girl was seriously injured by shrapnel, a tragic exception in what was otherwise a near-perfect defense. The world celebrated it as a triumph of technology, a testament to the ingenuity of Israel's defense industry and the strength of its alliances. And it was. It was a staggering display of human capability. But within Israel, another conversation was taking place, a quieter, more profound one. The question was not just how they had survived, but why? Why, after all these years, did they possess such a uniquely effective shield? How had a tiny nation with a fraction of the resources of its adversaries managed to create a defense system so advanced it seemed to come from the future? The focus shifted from the miracle of the interception to the miracle of the invention itself. Was the technology, this Iron Dome, this arrow, this David sling, merely a product of human intellect, or was it, too, part of the pattern? Was the inspiration, the knowledge, the very ability to forge such a shield a modern form of divine intervention?
From an angel in the dark to a choir in the light, from ghost tanks in a valley of tears to a mysterious wind from the sea, from malfunctioning rockets and errant scuds to an almost perfect shield of iron and fire. Is it all just a series of fortunate accidents, a long, unbroken chain of statistical improbabilities? Is it simply the story of a resilient people with a brilliant military and a powerful will to survive? That is the logical, the rational, the comfortable explanation. And perhaps it is the correct one. But to accept it, one must ignore the sheer weight of the pattern. One must dismiss the consistency of the theme that runs through 3 millennia of history, the theme of deliverance arriving at the moment of absolute despair. The story of Israel challenges us. It forces us to look beyond the cold calculus of war and consider the possibility of another factor in the human equation. It asks us to question the limits of our own understanding. Perhaps the miracles are not meant to be proof. Perhaps they are meant to be an invitation to look at the world with a sense of wonder, to recognize that not everything can be measured or explained, an invitation to believe that even in our darkest, most desperate hours, we are not alone. The ultimate truth of these events may be unknowable, hidden in the heart of God or in the complex tapestry of chance, but the human truth is undeniable. For the people who have lived these stories, the soldier who saw a phantom army, the pilot who witnessed a missile diverted by the wind, the teacher who felt an urge to cancel a class and saved 30 lives. It is not a matter of debate. It is a lived reality. In the end, this is not just Israel's story. It is a story for all of us. It is a story about the enduring power of hope in the face of hopelessness. It is a testament to the idea that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe is not the weapon in your hand, but the faith in your heart. And that even when technology fails and all human effort seems lost, there may still be a shield, unseen, unheard, holding back the storm.